About 2 weeks ago, my father sent me a text message to let me know that my grandma, his mother, had passed away. She was 91 years old when she died just about 2 weeks ago exactly. And over the course of her life, she had some pretty difficult situations that came up in her life. When she was younger, she was in a pretty terrible car accident that left her in a situation where her back was suffered from back pain really for the majority of her life. She suffered also from breast cancer and had a double mastectomy. And then later in her life, the last few years of her life, she developed a disorder called progressive supranuclear palsy. It's kind of an uncommon brain disorder that affects your movement, the control of your walking, your balance, your speech, your ability to swallow, your ability to see, just your mood, your behavior. It's a brain disease that results from nerve cells in the brain being damaged. I remember over the last few years, my grandmother's life significantly went downhill. She went from a place where she was able to be mobile and take care of herself to a place where she was bedridden for the last year straight or more. She went from a place where she could take care of herself to somebody else having to wait on her, multiple people having to take care of her. I remember last summer we were up visiting her as they moved back from Louisville, Kentucky up into the Minneapolis area, and I was taking my kids to see her. She had not seen, I think, my youngest kids for a few years particularly, and so we were up there visiting, and I remember just looking at her and seeing her life as it was kind of she was so frail and just laying there in this bed really unable to move. And one of the things about my grandma is that she spent a lot of her time singing. She had a beautiful voice, and one of the effects of this disorder is that it attacks your vocal cords, it attacks your throat, and so she was unable over the course of the last few years to even able to sing, let alone even able to talk. I remember my daughter Nev was 3 years old last summer when she saw her, and her voice was so distorted that Nev kind of had this horrified look on her face. And needless to say, she experienced a lot of pain and suffering, particularly from this disorder that she had over the last few years that she was diagnosed with, to the point where I remember looking at her from a few years ago to when she died, and it was two totally different people in the pictures, if you will. There's a lot of suffering and pain, and there's my grandfather who's 90 years old. They've been married for about 60, I can't remember how, 60-some years they were married for. So he's 90, she's 91, and now he has spent the last however many years of his life married to her. In the last few years of his life, really dedicated to be by her side to take care of her. And then the pain that he is experiencing from the loss of the death of his wife. You know, there's all kinds of pain and suffering we will experience in our life due to disease, to illness, sickness, and even death. Us personally will experience it, and those around us will experience it. And none of us will escape the reality of death that is about to come. And all of us will experience the suffering from these things, whether to us personally or whether from those around us that we love and we care about. And we see this here this evening in this story, really, where there's two stories wrapped into one. Jairus and his daughter, 12 years old, who's on the brink of death. And then this woman who has been bleeding for 12 years straight. They were suffering. They were in pain. They were in agony. They were desperate. And you and I will find ourselves in situations like that as well over the course of our life, if we have not already. Some of you tonight, you're here and you've experienced all kinds of pain. There may be chronic pain or illness that you have in your life. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to look at four questions. Four questions. The first one, what is true about Jesus and our suffering? What about faith? Why suffering? And then what are we to do? The first one, what is true about Jesus and our suffering? You know, there's a number of things that are true, and not just true about Jesus when we are suffering, but true about Jesus all the time. But when we suffer, it's so important to understand who Christ is, to know who Jesus is. Now, there's lots of things I could say. In fact, there's a list of like 8+ things I wanted to say, but you would be here, we would be here for a long time, and no one wants to do that. So I have boiled it down to 4, and I may only end up doing 3. We'll see how this goes. But what is true about Jesus? What do we need to know, remember about Christ? When it comes to this place of suffering, there's 4 things here, again, from this passage. The first one is this, is Jesus is accessible. He's available. You look at the beginning of this story. When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Remember, Jesus and the disciples at this point had sailed across the Sea of Galilee to this region of Gerasenes, which was opposite the land of Galilee. But they had then crossed the sea back to Galilee. So Jesus is here in Galilee, and we're told the crowds welcomed him because they were waiting and expecting him. They were anticipating his return. Now, this is in a stark contrast to the crowds of Gerasa that we saw last week. If you remember, after Jesus healed the demon-possessed man, they wanted him to leave. They wanted him to get out of town. They wanted him gone. But here in Galilee, like most instances, we find the crowd, they're waiting around for him, waiting with anticipation for him to return. Why? Well, I think because for the most part, they saw Jesus do all these miracles, and they wanted him to do more miracles. They were, in a sense, entertained by him, and they wanted to experience the benefit of what he had to offer. And so the crowd is pumped, and they're ready for Jesus to do more miraculous things. They're ready to see more spectacular things take place. And at this moment, the crowds, again, they're pumped. They're anticipated as Jesus is coming back. And then there's this man named Jairus, verse 41. He was a leader of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. Jairus approaches Jesus. And who is Jairus? Well, we're told that he is a leader of the synagogue. He's an official of the synagogue. In other words, he was a respected leader, steeped in the Old Testament and devoted to the religion of Judaism. He was one of those responsible for overseeing all the activities that took place at the synagogue, which was really the focal point of the Jewish life in the city. So Jairus was a leading figure in Capernaum's religious establishment, which in turn was connected then to the national Judaism, which was mainly in the hands of the Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and the scribes, if you remember, they're hostile towards Jesus and even sought to destroy Jesus. So Jairus is kind of a part of this crowd. But Jairus comes to Jesus, and Jairus doesn't come to Jesus as part of this religious establishment, this elite religious establishment, but he comes to Jesus as a father who is weary, who is weighed down by grief, stricken by grief due to the fact that his only daughter, his daughter who is 12 years old, is dying. She's on the brink of death. Now, I'm sure if you're a parent, you can somewhat relate. Maybe you haven't had a child that's close to death, but you've had a child that's sick or a child that gets injured. I still remember, and I've shared this before, but when McCabe broke his arm for the first time swinging outside in the backyard, and it was like in this kind of up-down pattern. It was quite disgusting, and he comes running into the house, and I can see it, pointing the wrong direction as he's coming to the house, and immediately you just are kind of just filled with this sense of grief and sorrow, and you think to yourself, what do I need to do to make it better, right? How do I fix this thing? I know I can't fix this thing. How do I fix what's going on? And this man was in this similar boat, and even a more desperate spot. All he cared about was saving his daughter, seeing his daughter spared from death. He didn't care what people thought, particularly the religious leaders. He didn't care what they thought about him going to Jesus. He just cared about saving his daughter. That in his mind, he thought, how is my daughter going to be healed? Just like in my situation with McCabe, how am I going to fix his broken arm? I need to go to the doctor. I need to get to the ER, to the place where they can help him, where they can put his arm back in place. And Jairus is in this same situation, this desperate situation where he's thinking, who do I know that can help my daughter? And he thinks, I remember Jesus. See, Jairus would have probably come in contact with Jesus over the course of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. He's preaching in and out of the synagogue. Jairus would have known Jesus, would have heard about Jesus, would have seen maybe some of the things that Jesus had done, the miraculous things, people being healed. And so he thought, I'm going to Jesus, despite the fact what he would have been thought about him in doing so. But he's desperate, he's in despair, he's hopeless. And when we're hopeless, when we're in despair, when we're desperate, we're willing to do things that may not even look good to our friends, to our family. We're willing to go against the grain of what oftentimes maybe is normal or matters, or we really begin to stop thinking about what someone cares about us because we're desperate to get help. And Jairus was desperate. His daughter is on the brink of dying. And the truth is, when we're suffering, when we experience pain and trial in our life, what we see with Jairus is that Jairus comes to the feet of Jesus, and we find that Jesus is available. He is accessible. In fact, in Matthew 11, Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Come to me, all of you who are weary, who are burdened. Oftentimes I think we can find ourselves in states or in situations where we're in pain, we're in need, we're suffering due to some disease, illness, or someone in our life that they're in pain or whatever it might be. And we can feel like God is distant, that He's far off, that He's not near, that He's unavailable to us. But what the Scriptures show us is that Jesus is accessible. Jesus is available. He is someone we can go to when we're in pain, in trial, in suffering. Jesus wasn't only accessible to the crowds. He wasn't just there to wow the crowds of people, but He was there to help the individual. He was available for the individual. And in the great moment of need in this man's life and Jairus' life, Jesus was available. He had access to Jesus. And I think about that's even more true for us as believers, as sons and daughters of Christ, that Christ living inside of us, that those who have trusted in Jesus, Jesus lives in you and we have access to Him. And sometimes this can just wash over us, like kind of just water off a duck's back, like it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, I can go talk to God. But do you really believe that? Do you really believe that Jesus is available to you even when you're in the most hurting of times, in the most painful of times? We find as Jesus is accessible. Second is that Jesus cares. Jairus is at Jesus' feet and he is begging Jesus. He's begging him to come to his house to heal his daughter. My kids beg for things all the time. They'll beg for candy or beg for gum, things that are really pretty irrelevant to life. But we've all been in a situation where we want something, we desire something strongly, and so we go to our parent or we go to, our boss or whatever. We go somewhere and we beg. We go to our spouse and we try to beg them to give us whatever it is that we want. And Jairus is in that type of situation, only his daughter's life is on the line, and he is begging Christ. He is at his feet. And what does Jesus do? How does he respond? Well, in verse 44, he says, while he was going. See, what Jesus did is when Jairus came to him and he laid down before him and he begged Jesus to come with him, Jesus didn't look at Jairus and say, go find someone else. Jesus didn't look at Jairus and say, you know what, I think someone else can take care of you, you'll be fine. He didn't just ignore Jairus as he's there, begging him to come to his home to heal his daughter, but rather Jesus went with him. Jesus began to walk down that road to his home, to where his daughter, his only daughter, 12-year-old daughter, is lying in bed, dying. And Jesus began to go with Jairus to his home. Why? Well, because Jesus actually cares about Jairus. He cares about Jairus' daughter. He cares about the heartache that he was going through, about the grief and the pain that he was experiencing because of his daughter, his only daughter about to die. And the realization that Jairus knew that there was nothing that he could do about it. See, Jesus went with him because he cares, because he has compassion. Jesus is available and accessible to us because he actually cares about us. He cares about you. And because he cares about you, he will walk with you. I just love this picture of him going with Jairus, because this is the picture, the image that we ought to have when it comes to Christ in our life, is that he goes with us. Now, obviously, we're going with him, the idea that we're submitted to him, but he is with us, and he is there to take care of us. That he has compassion for us. That he's with you in the darkest moments of your life, the greatest pain of your life, and he is concerned about you. He cares deeply for you. And I think this is important here as you look at this story, this idea that he doesn't care about you because of who you are in the eyes of society or because of what you have done, what you have accomplished. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at this story, remember there's Jairus, but there's another event happening simultaneously that's intertwined in this story. It's about this woman who has been suffering for 12 years from bleeding. And verse 42 says, while he was going, the crowds were nearly crushing him. And this woman, suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who spent all she had on doctors, yet could not be healed by any, approached him from behind and touched the end of his robe, and instantly her bleeding stopped. Jesus is on the way to Jairus' house, and this crowd they're smashing in on him. And at this moment, some woman grabs his robe. This woman, like Jairus, was desperate, for she had been bleeding for 12 years straight. Now, this is a big deal because due to her bleeding, she was ceremonially unclean. And because she was bleeding constantly, anyone or anything that came in contact with her also became ceremonially unclean. So what did that mean for her life? Well, that meant she could not go to the temple. She could not attend the synagogue. That no one in her family could touch her. She couldn't touch anything else without making it unclean. Therefore, she was an outcast of Jewish society. She was ostracized from her own family, from her own friends. That the central parts of the Jewish life, the synagogue, the temple, she was not able to participate in. She was the social outcast. Well, here's the point. What you have is you have Jairus, who's a part of this religious elite, who is a well-known, well-respected man in Galilee. And then you have this woman who's this outcast and ostracized from everybody. And what we find is that Jesus cares about both of them. He's available and accessible to both of them. He has compassion on both of them. See, Jesus doesn't care about one or the other because of what position they held in society or because of what they had accomplished or not accomplished, but because He has created them in His image and likeness. They are people that He has made in His own image and likeness. And see, God cares about you and me in our suffering. He cares about us all the time, when things are going well and when things are going not so well. He cares about you when you're going through the most difficult times of your life, and He's available for you to go to Him. And I think this can be a point of struggle for many of us. Does God really care about my life? Especially when things are going difficult, when things aren't going well, we can tend to think that God doesn't care about me because we can have this impression that in order for God to care about me, in order for God to really love me, to be good towards me, things have to be going well in my life. But that couldn't be further from the truth. God's love for you, His concern for you, His compassion for you doesn't change based off of the situation, the event that you're in. In fact, what we find in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, he says, casting all your cares on Him because He cares about you. He genuinely loves you. And in our darkest moments and days when life is hard, when someone close to us passes away, we find our body stricken with some disease, some illness, what's easy to do is to think God is distant and He's far off and He doesn't care. But the truth of the matter is the exact opposite. Is the reality. He is close and accessible, and He deeply cares about what's happening in your life. And He wants you to cast those cares on Him. The worry, the anxiety that comes up, the what ifs, the unknowns, to put them on Him. Because He cares deeply for you and for me. So Jesus is accessible, He cares. Thirdly, He is powerful. Jesus is powerful in our suffering. Now, what do I mean? Well, Jesus has the power to overcome disease and death. He has the power to restore a person back to health and to bring someone back to life. And this truth is powerfully demonstrated with Jairus and with the hemorrhaging woman. We first look here at the bleeding woman, verses 42 through 48. Again, the crowds are pushing in on Jesus, and this woman who's, again, suffering from bleeding for 12 years. She had spent all she had on doctors, yet could not be healed by anybody. So Jesus is on the way to Jairus' home, and Jesus is interrupted by this woman who has this severe medical problem. one that had gone on for as long as Jairus' daughter was in fact alive. And you think about this, Jairus and his wife had enjoyed watching their daughter grow up, looking forward to what her life was going to become, looking forward to her future, while this woman had endured over the course of that same period of time 12 years of misery, 12 years of suffering. I mean, she had to deal with continual bleeding, probably fatigue and loss of strength due to blood loss. Perhaps even constant pain and possibly even the fear that this might take her own life. That this might actually take her life, that she might die from whatever it is that she had. But the social implications were just as bad, if not worse. As that a few moments ago, this woman who was constantly bleeding was therefore continually unclean. For as long as the bleeding persists, then she was ceremonially unclean. So she couldn't go to the temple, couldn't go to the synagogue. Her own family couldn't touch her. Imagine that. Imagine your own family not being able to touch you for the fact that they too would become ceremonially unclean, or you touching anything would become ceremonially unclean. Imagine that something you didn't even do was now creating this ostracization in your life, that you are separated from your own family and your own friends. Now there's pain because of the thing that you're experiencing, but there's another level of pain when you're someone who is kind of kicked out of relationships. When your friends, when your support, when the people who are around you are no longer there around you. It's one thing to suffer physically, but then to be outcasted by your own friends and family, by your own community, there's a whole nother level of pain and suffering. And this can still be the case today with those who have illnesses, diseases, who are suffering. Someone who's lost someone close to them, they can feel isolated, left alone, and even in a sense rejected. Suffering can be a lonely path to walk on. And not necessarily because that person is outcasted in our modern day, but simply because others often can't really relate to what it is that you're going through. And so though people may be around you, you can feel completely alone, right? You can feel, in a sense, isolated. And I'm sure this woman felt this. And even to a greater degree, because she was ostracized. She was a social outcast. Not to mention in her life, the medicine of the day was no help at all. You think, okay, at least I can get some type of cure to help me to get reintegrated back into society, to be able to live this life, to be ceremonially clean, but the medicine did no good. In fact, Mark tells us, and he says she had endured much under many doctors, and she had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. So she goes to these doctors in order to get help, only to find no help, no cure. In fact, things only got worse. And the doctors of this day, the prescriptions or the methods prescribed in order to cure what she had were actually extremely bizarre. I'll give you an example of a few of them. One remedy consisted of drinking a goblet of wine containing a powder compounded from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses. Now, I don't even know what that all is exactly. You'd have to Google what that exactly is. But another treatment consisted of a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine, administered with the summons, "Arise out of your flow of blood." So you're supposed to drink this, and at the same time, someone's supposed to say to you, "Arise out of your flow of blood." And then you do that, and you're like, nothing changed. I'm still bleeding. You're like, what? Or then another physician would prescribe sudden shock, or the carrying of the ash of an ostrich egg in a certain cloth. So you get this ostrich egg and you apparently burn it, and you take the ash and you put it in this cloth and you carry that around. And somehow that's supposed to heal you of your bleeding. I mean, there's some weird kind of things like, homegrown like ideas of how to take care of yourself and whatnot. But this is kind of, beats all of those. I mean, taking the ostrich egg, burning it, ashes in a cloth, and you're walking around, someone sees you carrying this cloth of ashes, like, what are you doing? Well, I'm just trying to heal myself from all the bleeding that keeps going on in my life. You're like, okay, great. How's that working for you? Not well, not working at all. And so she tried all this stuff, and you would try it too. If you were desperate and you had nothing was working, you would go to whatever you could do to figure out, how can I get healed? How can I get rid of this disease, this illness that is attacking my life? Like Jairus, she was hopeless and desperate for someone to cure. So what does she do? Well, Mark tells us, having heard about Jesus. Like Jairus, she had heard about Jesus. She had heard about the healings of others with diseases, chronic illnesses, disabilities like blindness. And so with all of her money spent, cut off from all of her friends and family, she anxiously and she desperately forces her way through the crowd of people to get to Jesus. If I can just get to Jesus, she says, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. That's what Luke tells us. Mark tells us in Mark 5:20. If I can just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. And so she in Luke 8:44 approached from behind and touched the end of his robe. And what happens? Instantly, her bleeding stops. Not sort of stops, not slowly gets better, but Luke tells us instantly, immediately, it stops. I mean, just think about this. Years of suffering from this bleeding are now instantly over. I mean, they come to a screeching halt at the moment she touches or grabs the tassel on the robe of Christ. And something interesting happens. The bleeding stops, but Jesus asks this question, who touched me? Who touched me? It says, when they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowds are hemming you in and pressing against you. Peter's kind of like, what are you talking about, Jesus? There are people all around you. You've ever been to a concert before where you're just like squished next to people? I've been to a number of concerts over the course of my life where you're standing next to people and you're not sure if the sweat is your sweat or the sweat of the other person. Like you leave and you smell and you're like, I don't know if that's me or that's like 50 other people who have touched me. And you're just drenched. I remember leaving a concert my brother and I went to in Kansas City years ago, and we were both just our clothes were absolutely saturated. And I just thought to myself, this is disgusting. It's one thing to know when I'm playing a sport and I'm drenched from my own sweat. It's a whole other thing to know that you have been rubbing against all other kinds of people, and they are also have their sweat all over you now. Like you want to take a shower more than you ever want to take a shower in your life. And so there's all these people just pressed around, and Peter's kind of like, what do you mean, Jesus? I mean, they're smashed around you. And Jesus says, someone did touch me. I know that power has gone out from me, and this is an amazing statement. I know that power has gone out from me, because in this statement, Jesus is making it clear he has power, and that power has left him, not in a way that it's gone away from him, it's gone out to someone. Who did it go to? This woman. It says, when the woman saw that she was discovered, she came trembling and fell down before him. In the presence of all the people, she declared the reason she had touched him and how she was instantly healed. Daughter, he said, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, why would Jesus do this? Why would he spend time wondering, asking, who touched me? Obviously, he knows, right? He's God. He knows what's going on. He knew who touched him. So what was he doing? Well, I think because he wanted her to reveal herself. He wanted her to come forward and reveal herself for a couple reasons. One is because it made it clear that Jesus was the reason she was healed. But number two, it does something for her. Not only is she healed physically, but she's also healed socially. That once her bleeding has stopped, she's no longer this outcast that she's been for 12 long years. She's no longer someone who is ceremonially unclean, who's ostracized from her own people. That she has come out and she confesses and she says why she touched Jesus, because I believe he's the only one that can actually heal me, and he did heal me. And at that moment, everyone sees not only that Christ physically healed her, but the reality that she is then restored socially. And Jesus' power is demonstrated in this woman's life, in the fact that he heals her physically, this chronic illness that she had, or disease, or whatever it was that she had, that no one had been able to figure out, was suddenly removed from her life. And not only was there this physical healing, but this reality where socially she was brought back into relationship with her people. But then again, you have Jairus and his dying daughter. Remember, this woman interrupted Jesus. She interrupted what Jesus was in the process of doing, which was going to Jairus' home to hopefully save Jairus' dying daughter. And in the process of caring for this woman, something tragic happens. While he was still speaking, verse 49, someone came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." Your daughter is dead. Tragically, Jairus' daughter passes away. Now, this would have been just absolutely gut-wrenching. I don't know what it's like to lose a child. And to be honest with you, I hope I never find out. But I know people that have. And just the pain that you experience. How difficult that is. Yeah. People in our own church who have seen their children pass away far sooner than you would hope. And it's like someone just punches you in the gut. That all the air is just removed from your lungs. I mean, he had gotten to Jesus. And while she's still alive, he gets to Jesus, and Jesus started walking with him to his home. There's hope. There's this light at the end of the tunnel because Jesus was coming. But then there's this blow, this crushing blow of pain and agony. There was pain that his daughter, he could do nothing, but then there was this another level of pain that I'm sure Jairus experienced. He was desperate because his precious daughter was about to die, but now his worst fear is realized. She has died. And while Jairus is helping this lowly outcast of a woman, his precious daughter passes away. And I'm sure thoughts of if only go into his mind. If only she would have left Jesus alone. If only he wouldn't have helped her. If only he didn't worry about drawing her out into the open after she was healed. If only I could only imagine that's what's going through his mind, and maybe has gone through some of your minds as well. But aware of what's going on in Jairus' heart and the gut-wrenching despair he's experiencing, Jesus says something to him. He looks at Jairus. He's been told his daughter has died, and the person who came obviously doesn't believe Jesus can do anything. He says, "Don't worry, don't bother the teacher anymore." But Jesus looks square in the face at Jairus, looks into his eyes and says, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Only believe and she will be saved." Now, I don't think what Jesus is teaching here, which we'll get into in a minute, is that somehow her being saved was conditioned on Jairus' faith. Remember, Jesus actually cares about us. And what Jesus does, and one of the ways he shows his care and concern for us, is he encourages us with the truth. Don't be afraid, only believe. I think he's reassuring Jairus. He's reassuring him that his daughter and him are in good hands. They're in good hands. In fact, I can't remember if it's Matthew or Mark tells us that Jairus even says that, "I believe if you touch her that she'll be healed," that he has this faith. He believes, he continues to believe that Jesus can. And Luke tells us after he came to the house, he let no one enter with him except Peter, James, John, and the child's father and mother. And everyone was crying and mourning for her. Due to the delay of Jesus getting there to Jairus' home, there was not enough time for people to gather, and the funeral had already started. There was time for people to get to the home. The funeral had probably already begun. Reason being is Jews did not embalm people. And so the mourners or those who knew would have been notified once the girl was dying that this might be it, and so you should start coming. And so when Jesus got there, the funeral more than likely was in full swing. And in contrast to our modern funerals, which are usually somewhat more quiet and somber, depending on the funeral you go to, a first century Jewish funeral was really, as one commentator said, a scene of barely controlled chaos. There's the mourners, both of the friends and the family of the loved ones, as well as traditional hired female mourners. So they would hire these mourners to come, and they would loudly scream and wail and tear their clothes. I mean, they're screaming and yelling and tearing their clothes. I just have the image of like WWE or something like that. They're coming screaming, a little bit different context, but just screaming and yelling and tearing off whatever little clothing they're wearing. But they're in this state of mourning. And there's this dissonant music playing within these high-pitched flutes. And there's just this loudness going on all around them. And since Jairus was a well-respected leader in the community, there probably were lots of people there. And Jesus looks at all these people and he says, "Stop crying, because she's not dead but asleep." And they laughed at him because they knew she was dead. So he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned and she got up at once. And then he gave orders that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. This girl was dead. The people knew she was dead. But death's hold on this girl was shattered. That her spirit returned to her, that life came back to her body, and not just any life, but her own life. And once her life was restored, she immediately got up. She didn't lie there for some moment or progressively get better. There was no recovery period, no rehabilitation. But Jesus spoke, and instantly she was healed. Immediately her life was fully restored and given back to her. And to show it, he ordered them to give her something to eat. Again, you just see the tender care and compassion of Jesus. But in this, you see Jesus has power. He has power not only over the wind and the waves or over the demonic, but even over sickness and death. He has power to bring those who are dead back to life. And here's the question you have to think about is, do you believe that? In our modern time, do you believe that Jesus has the power to heal the sick, to bring the dead back to life? Do you really believe, when you look at this story, it's just a story of something that, that happened then, but not for now. Do you really believe that Jesus has the power to heal? That he has power over illness? That he has power over death? Now that brings up probably a bigger question here about faith. And so the question then is, what about faith? What about faith here? How does faith play into this? You see the woman that she is told by Jesus, "Daughter, you have been healed, been saved because of your faith." He tells Jairus, "Just believe and she'll be saved." So what about faith? How does faith play into this? Well, this is faith. I think faith is believing that God can do what he says he can do. That faith is believing Jesus has the power to heal, the power to bring the dead back to life. But the question that arises, at least in my mind, when I look at a passage like this, or talk about faith in relationship to healing, is this question: is if Jesus has the power to heal, then why am I still suffering? Or why are there people in our church who are still suffering? If Jesus can heal, if Jesus has power over illness, sicknesses, disorders, over death, then why? Why are people still suffering? Why aren't they healed? Well, I want to give you just two things I think that will help when it comes to the healings of Jesus. The first is this, is Jesus' miracles or healings were to validate that he is God. When you read the Gospels, there's lots of healings that are taking place in the Gospels. And over in the Gospel of John, John refers to his miracles as signs. An example of this is John 2:11, where he says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs in the Cana of Galilee, which was turning water to wine. The first of his signs, again, over and over. And see, what these miracles did is they displayed the divine power of Jesus. They attested to the fact that he was indeed the Son of God. In fact, John specifically states that the miracles he included in his gospel were for the purpose that his reader may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's why he put them in there. That Jesus' miracles validated his divine sonship. The fact that he had the authority to forgive sins. They were used to authenticate who he was. That he's coming on the scene making this claim about who he was, and his miracles validated that claim that he was in fact the Messiah, the Son of God. The second then thing is this, is the object of faith was in Jesus' ability to heal, not his will to heal. I think this is very important. The object of faith was in Jesus' ability. It was in Jesus able to do so, not that he will. In these two circumstances or instances, as well as others, this is what we see going on. They believed that Jesus had the ability to heal, not that it was his will to automatically do so. And I think this is where things can get quite confusing. We think that faith is not only the believing that God can heal, but therefore that he's automatically going to do it, that he will do it. But I, at least, am not convinced that's the right way to think. I mean, the right way to think is that Jesus has the ability to do it, that he can do it. He has the power to do it. And because he has the power to do it, we will go and ask him to do it. Dr. Jerry Bridges, he comments on this idea. He says, to say that I have faith that God will heal is presumptuous, since we do not know the mind of God. But to say God is able to heal is to exercise faith. To say that I have faith that God will heal is presumptuous, since we do not know the mind of God. But to say God is able to heal is to exercise faith. That to exercise faith is to believe that God can do it and to go to him and say and asking him to do so. But I think we have to understand that just because God can heal does not mean he will. You know, in these situations in the Bible, these ones tonight and others, we're seeing what is ideal, what God is clearly able to do and at times does do. But that doesn't mean he will do so in every instance. And we can look at these stories and we can think that if I have faith in Jesus, then he will heal me, that he has to heal me, or he has to heal my son, or has to heal my daughter who is sick. Or we can think if I'm not healed, then I must not have enough faith, as many will say. But both, I think, are wrong. Listen, Jesus healed people all the time who didn't have faith. And yes, he clearly healed people who had faith, but that doesn't mean that he will heal you or me in our exact situation, that we have to understand that God is not obligated to do so. But faith, rather, is believing that he can. Faith is trusting God and continuing to trust him in what he promises. These people exhibit faith. They go to Jesus and they beg Jesus, or the woman works her way through the crowd to grab the tassel of Jesus because he believed that Jesus was able to heal. That's what faith, in essence, is. I believe that you, God, can do what you say you are able to do. So the question then is, then why suffering? Why is this always happening? Why does suffering take place? And there's a number of ways to answer this question. But suffering physically, emotionally, socially should remind us of a deeper reason why there is suffering. See, suffering in our world really is due to sin. And sin comes from us. And sin has a greater suffering attached to it. Not only does sin produce suffering in our life, there's broken relationships, that our bodies are broken, they're frail, they're fragile, they can fall into illness. But sin has a greater suffering attached to it, an eternal suffering attached to it, eternal separation from God in hell. See, every human being stands in this position where they have sinned against God, where they have wronged God, they have disobeyed God. And because God is just, because he is fair, because he does love, he will punish every single person for the sin they have committed. And the punishment for any person who has sinned against God is eternal separation from God in hell. And this is why Jesus came in the first place. See, Jesus didn't come in the first place to do all these miracles to heal people here physically. That's not the primary reason that he came, but he came to heal us from something even greater. He came to save us from something even greater, the penalty for our sin. To restore us from something greater, the effect of our sin. Think back here to the hemorrhaging woman, the bleeding woman, and what Jesus says to her in verse 48. He says to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." The word saved here is used in a number of places, one of those being in Luke 7, verse 50, where he says to a different woman, "Your faith has saved you, go in peace." And the woman here is the woman who is deemed the sinner of the town, who came to Jesus and poured the alabaster jar of perfume on the feet of Jesus. And so when Jesus said, "Your faith has saved you," is clearly in this context of salvation from sin. Not to mention, like the woman in chapter 7, Jesus tells the woman here in chapter 8 who's been bleeding, "Go in peace. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Why would he make that statement? Well, because her faith has saved her from sin, and now she is at peace with God through the Lord Jesus Christ. She is called the daughter, or he calls her daughter, even to indicate that there's this right relationship now between her and God, that this separation, this enmity, this strife that was between her and God was now removed, that she is now at peace with God. And see, what our suffering, oftentimes what God is trying to do is he's trying to bring us to this place of realization that what we ultimately need is him. That what we need is Christ. That what we need is to be more dependent on Jesus Christ. And suffering and pain have a way of getting our attention like nothing else will. When your daughter, who's 12 years old, your only daughter, is lying in her bed, dying, about to die, or you're suffering from chronic pain over the course of 12 years of your life, there is nothing that will get your attention like pain and suffering. And see, God is using pain and suffering to draw us to a greater reality that we desperately need him. See, when we find ourselves suffering, when we find ourselves desperate, we're wondering, who do we turn to? There's this reality where we realize what I really need, what I ultimately need is Jesus. I need Jesus for the salvation of my soul from the sin that I have committed, and I need Jesus to help me to walk faithfully to him as I go through this pain in my own life. That I need Jesus. And see, Jesus is trying to draw us to this place where we desperately need him. Where we're like the woman and we're like Jairus, and we fall on our face before him and we cry out to him. Because we realize we can't do this without him. We need him. We need him. That suffering, that pain, that trial in our life, God is using it to push us to a place of greater dependency on Christ. So in closing, just a few applications. The first one is this: rejoice in your suffering. All of us are going to experience suffering to one degree or another, and over again the Bible instructs us to rejoice. And why can we rejoice? Well, I think in part why we can rejoice, because in one sense, suffering is God's grace in our life. And what I mean by that is that he's using the pain and the trial in our life to drive us to a deeper dependency on him, which is ultimately what is best for our life. See, what's best for your life and best for my life is to be dependent on Christ, to be desperate for Christ, to be devoted to Christ. That's what's best. And so Jesus can give us a different perspective on our suffering, where we can rejoice because I can look at my suffering as God's grace in my life, pushing me into a deeper dependency on Him. Secondly, then, is in your suffering, hold on to Jesus. Hold on to Jesus. As believers in Christ, what we need to do is go to Him. What does that mean? Well, that means we need to go to His Word and to His promises and cling to those promises, to that truth of who He is and what He promises to do. That even in those moments, remembering that suffering is not forever, but it's only for a moment. That one day we'll be with Christ and all of our suffering will be over. It will be done with. Then our suffering, we go to Him in prayer and we cast our concern and our care on Him. Then our suffering, we cry out to Him and we ask Him even to heal us, to change the situation that we're in, because He can, but with the understanding that He may not. But we hold on to Him. We walk by faith, trusting in who He is and what He has promised to us. And lastly, fourth, well, really the fourth in my four, but I'm not going to skip. We're going to skip the third one. The fourth one is this: is hold on to Jesus for the salvation of your soul. If you're here tonight and you have not repented and put your faith in Christ, my encouragement to you would be to do so. See, what Jesus really cares about is your soul. And He's going to use pain and suffering in your life to wake you up to the reality of a deeper need in your life, which is eternal. That ultimately what you need is you need Him. Because He is the only one that can save you from the penalty of your sin, from the wrath of God to come. This woman was saved, I don't think just physically, but also spiritually, because she had faith. It was the faith that saved her. It was her faith in Jesus that made her right with God. And so for us too, it's our faith in Christ that brings us into this place where we're right with God. And where when we die, we don't go to a separate place from God, eternity in hell, but we go to be with God forever in heaven. And Jesus cares about you and He loves you. And He brings pain into our life to wake us up to our need for Him. Let's pray. Father, God, even though that is true, that can be so hard to grasp. But we all know that when we're in pain and suffering, we might know the right answers, but the reality of what we're feeling is so hard. And so, God, we ask for your grace, God, just to help us to see what is true, to really cling to you, to trust in you. God, give us grace to see just our suffering from the right lens, to understand, God, that you care deeply about us, that you are available to us and you are powerful in our suffering. You're over it. You're above it. You're in control of it. We can trust you in it. And give us the faith to trust you in times when there is great difficulty and hardship that we are experiencing. And we just pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.